Hello, everybody. So this is in continuation of our lesson on nervous system. So the last slide we discussed was the blood-brain barrier, and I told you guys that it's this buffer zone, this security zone that essentially ensures that nothing bad can come inside the central nervous system. What we see here in this slide is basically showing this difference in the location of the gray matter and the white matter between the brain, which is basically on the top here, and the spinal cord, which is here. Okay. Now the brain gray matter, as you can see, is on the outside, right? Whereas the white matter is on the inside. Okay, so that's the first thing you should know. This is in contrast to the spinal cord. As you can see, it's the gray matter is on the inside, right? So here the gray matter was on the outside. So that's the difference between the brain and the spinal cord. What you also notice is that the deep gray or the deep nuclei, if you remember the deep structure, the deep brain structures are also located here, right? So maybe I can draw a line, like a dotted line. Let's say right there. So this area basically shows you the deep nuclei, and those are all essentially gray matters, right? So all of this, all of these deep nuclei are technically gray matter. Why? Because remember, nucleus by definition is a collection of soma, right? That's why we call them deep nuclei. And soma are by definition not myelinated, and that's why they end up becoming gray. So all of these structures here are basically gray um, by nature already. And by the way, that includes, as you can see, thalamus, basal ganglia, and basal ganglia, limbic system, and thalamus. We'll talk about these deep nuclei uh, in the future slides, but what's important is that all of these three structures, the basal ganglia, thalamus, and the limbic system, are all around the ventricles. They actually surround the ventricles. Okay, so this is the overall structure of the central nervous system, right? So this part essentially was the brain, and then this part was the spinal cord, if you remember. And so I told you that the higher brain, right, the cerebrum, aka telencephalon, is made really out of the cerebral cortex. That's the folded area. And then we have the basic ganglia limbic system. That's essentially our uh, deep nuclei. The deep nuclei sometimes includes thalamus, sometimes it doesn't. So some textbooks include basal ganglia limbic system, and they add thalamus. Some textbooks some biologists exclude thalamus as part of deep nuclei. For this course, we're going to include them even though they're not here, even though thalamus is not here. But basically, we're going to be focusing on this part in the next few slides, right? We're going to talk about cerebrum. So cerebrum or telencephalon includes the cortex, which is the structure on the left, and the deep nuclei, which is the structure on the right. Okay? And remember, the cortex is essentially gray matter, right? So you can see that here too. We saw that the gray matter on the outside, this outside layer essentially is the cortex. Okay, so essentially this part is the cortex. And what you see here is the cerebral cortex, which has been folded, as you can see. And then here they're showing you the deep nuclei, which are these structures deep in the brain, which we're going to be dividing them into basal ganglia limbic system. Now notice I included the thalamus as a plus or minus because some people include thalamus in the deep nuclei, some people don't. This is the part of the brain, by the way, that essentially connects your conscious mind into your subconscious mind. So if you think about, things like your deep personality traits, let's say, things that sometimes you have no control over in terms of the way you behave or the way you think, those types of things. Uh, we can call them, let's say, metaphysical. right, metaphysical features of the human body is really found, or it would be related to these deep nuclei. And you guys will see what that means in a sec. Uh, those of you who want to be psychologists, when you think about subconscious mind and the conscious mind, really you're talking about these parts of the brain primarily, right? So again, as I said before, not a single part of the brain works in isolation. Every single part of the brain works with other parts, but there are regions of the brain that carry functions which would be their primary function. But if you look at the cortex, right? So this slide really focuses on the cortex. You can see that it has this gyri versus sulci or fissures. Those are the grooves. So you can see essentially the gyri are the stuff which are coming out. These are coming out, and then the sulci and fissures, those are going in. So what does that mean? If you remember um, my paper folding that I did in class, the parts of the paper that you would see on the surface, right, they would be bulging out. That would be the gyri, and then these deep cuts, as you can see, we call them sulci or fissures. If we call them, so if those cuts are small, we call them sulci, and if the cuts are big or large, long, uh, we call them fissures. So fissure and sulci are the same, except fissures are longer. There are a couple of fissures which I'll show you, but I'm going to actually draw them here for you. So here's one fissure right here. It goes in the middle, and there's another fissure which goes right in the middle of the brain. Okay, so that's number one right here at the. Okay, this kind of goes horizontally, and then this one goes vertically, right? So an XY axis of the brain, X, Y. This goes horizontal, this cuts the brain to half vertically. Um, and those are what we call the two big fissures, which we'll see in a sec. Now, or soul side, again, it doesn't matter. Sometimes we call them soul side, sometimes fissure. The point is that they're the ones which they're the essentially grooves. You also see, so that's what you need to know about the cortex with regards to this slide. Moving on to this picture, what you see on the left essentially is this longitudinal fissure, which is right here. As you can see, it's dividing the brain into two lobes, right? So the left lobe, right, and the right lobe. And remember, this picture is if you look at the brain from an anterior portion. Okay, so essentially this would be the left brain, this would be the right brain, right? So you could see that the longitudinal fissure cuts the brain to half, essentially your left and right brains. And then here we had the central sulcus, so central fissure. You can see that I drew that here, right? Number two. And this one here is what we call the lateral fissure or Sylvian fissure or lateral sulcus. That's again, that's your x-axis, that's your y-axis. The If you remember when I was talking about the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, frontal lobe would be here. I'm going to use the term FL, frontal lobe. I'm going to use the term here, parietal lobe, PL. If you remember the four lobes of the brain. And if you remember in class, I showed you using the Muckett that there is this part which we call central sulcus, and I told you right anterior to that, right in front of it, is what we call primary motor cortex. So this part is what we call primary motor cortex. All of this red area is the primary motor cortex. And then in the back side, what we have is we have primary sensory cortex, right? And I use the analogy of Miss Mary's office and the principal and the administration office, things like this. You know, uh, in summary, the frontal lobe's job is to execute, is to help you think and make conscious decisions, right? But it primarily helps you move. And so out of the entire frontal lobe, which includes the primary motor cortex, which is only this part, which is right in the front of the central sulcus, is the sort of the most important execution center essentially allowing you to move. And the same thing works out in the back side. So this is posterior to the central sulcus, and that's the primary sensory cortex. The entire parietal lobe's job is to carry out sensory function, somatosensory function, right? But again, the primary part here is the most important part, so to speak. If you look at the cortical divisions, now this is a bit more detailed. So let me just show you what we have here. Guys, this whole entire area, is frontal lobe, okay? This whole entire area right there is your parietal lobe, okay? And maybe, you know what, maybe I'll just use my, so here, this whole area, and this whole area, right? And then you have the occipital lobe, and finally the temporal lobe, okay? The lobe, lobe, and lobe. Make sure you understand what or where those lobes are and their main function, and their main functions are listed right below them, which I already discussed. And in this slide, I want to draw your attention to these new areas, which we call Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So those are your speech centers, right? So when we talk, uh, essentially talking counts as something that we execute. It counts as a movement type, um, essentially phenomena. So in that case, as you can see, the region dedicated to speech production, that's Broca's area, is located in the frontal lobe. So this one's job is to carry. This one's job is to carry what we call speech production. Speech production. Whereas this one, the Wernicke's area, which is right here, as you can see, his job is speech comprehension. In other words, when we speak, let's say somebody asks you a question, right? So the first thing you have to do is obviously to listen to them. So the signal comes from your ears. It goes to the temporal lobe because that's the part that deals with your auditory cortex, or has the auditory cortex. From there, the signal goes to your parietal lobe, which in this case is called the Wernicke's area, the speech comprehension center. In this region is where you really try to comprehend, to really understand what that person told you. Okay. And again, this pathway I'm showing you, that's a simplified pathway, right? It's obviously more complicated than that, but that's enough for this course. So once you reach the Wernicke's area, you can actually understand what the person said. From there, you have a signal that goes to your Broca's area, and then you decide to reply back if you want. For example, talk back or respond verbally, right? Of course, you have signals from the thinking area. You may decide to think what to say. You may have to use your frontal lobe to coordinate your speech, things like this. People who have trouble speaking, right? Whether they may stutter, or maybe when they speak, they don't sometimes make sense. This could be due to the fact that the Broca's area has been compromised. If you have difficulty understanding what people are telling you, so let's say a patient is unable to fully comprehend what other people tell them, right? Again, this is all speech related, so they have to be talking to them. So if you talk to somebody and they have difficulty understanding you, I mean, assuming there's no language barrier, then the Wernicke's area is probably compromised. The insular cortex, that's the cortex that folds back inside what we see on the front. Again, if you remember my paper, what I did with the paper in class, first it was a completely flat surface, and I kind of folded it into this this structure. And if you can imagine for a second, if you just grab a piece of paper which is flat and then just sort of squeeze it and squash it into something that looks like this, you can imagine that parts of the paper goes deep inside that squashed structure. that deep structure is what we call insular cortex. So still cortex, still has cortical tissue and cortical features, except it's a bit deeper. And there are two parts of the insular cortex which you should know that has essentially important function, and those are things like gustatory cortex, insular cortex for balance, and then olfactory cortex. Okay, so the gustatory cortex is for taste. The olfactory cortex is for sense of smell. And you can see this part deals with balance as included in this picture. So this slide shows you all the detailed functions of each lobe. Okay, so if you remember, I already told you what the four lobes are. So you have frontal lobe, you have parietal lobe, you have occipital lobe, and you have temporal lobe. And this is color coded. So if you pay close attention to the color differences, you can see what each lobe really is involved with. So as I mentioned before, reasoning, problem solving, voluntary movement, language production, personality, motor, emotions are all functions of the frontal lobe. Parietal lobe, sense with sensory, general sensation, gustation, that's the sense of taste. Okay, that's parietal lobe. Occipital lobe is primarily for vision purposes, visual signal analysis. Temporal lobe really deals with short-term memory, language comprehension, language, olfaction, and um, essentially hearing, right? Auditory, as you can see here, auditory functions. So I'm going to make sure this is comprehension, this is production. You guys make sure you know the difference. Remember, the language comprehension part, temporal lobe, was part of the Wernicke's area, as you can see here. Oh, by the way, I made a mistake. This should have been as part of the, that's actually part of the temporal lobe. There you go. Okay, so yeah, so make sure you really get a sense of what different parts of the brain or different lobes of the brain do. Wernicke's area is actually located here, even though this text is written here. Just be careful. And the Broca's area is actually located here. So those are your two speech centers of the brain. Next, we're going to discuss this homunculus, okay, or the little man. So if you actually Google homunculus, okay, it's this idea that basically tells you that in the picture, as you can notice, thumbs and the tip of the fingers, and here, as you can see, hands really, and the lower lip and the jaw, the size of those parts of your body are disproportionately larger than other parts of your body. And what this means, and for males, it's slightly the penile and the penis and the penile tissue are disproportionately larger than compared to your arms and your stomach and your buttocks and your legs. So what does this mean? The bigger the size of this picture that you see, the bigger the size of the finger or the organ or whatever structure that you see. And again, those include essentially your hands, the penis for the guys, and the lower lips and the lower jaw in the face, okay, and your ears. The bigger the area of the brain dedicated for somatosensory and motor cortical tissue. So let me repeat. The bigger the area that you see here, the bigger the area in the brain that the brain dedicated for that part of the body vis-a-vis somatosensory and motor function. So what does this mean? When somebody touches your hand, or when you're okay, so from a somatosensory perspective, if somebody touches your hand here, compared to somebody touching you in the shoulder area, guess what? The brain is more sensitive to this area, let's call it A, compared to part B. And it's not just a sensitivity, the brain actually dedicates a larger cortical area. Remember, the cortex has subdivisions, as you can see here. Some part of the cortex only deal with your knee. This part of the cortex deals with your elbow. This part of the cortex deals with your eyebrow. This part of the cortex, deals with swallowing, right? And of course, you have both motor cortical tissue and somatosensory cortical tissue. Okay. Um, but the question is the area of the cortex dedicated to the knee the same as the one dedicated to the hand? And the answer is absolutely not. The hand, because it has a larger picture in this larger size in this picture compared to the knee, which would be here. Now you don't see it in this picture, but this cortical area would be a lot bigger than this cortical area. Okay. Okay, again, you don't see it in this picture, but the area dedicated to the knee is a lot less than the area dedicated to the hand. And that's essentially depicted in this, what we call the little man or the homunculus, right? And the same thing is true for the penis or the hands compared to, I don't know, your chest, and your lower lip compared to your upper lip, and your jaw compared to your, for example, nose or something. Again, this goes both ways. This goes both from a sensory perspective and a motor perspective. If you think about why would you want to dedicate a larger area to your hand, cortical area, compared to, I don't know, your elbow. Where's your elbow? Right here. Why? So let's call this area A, let's call this one area B. Why would area A, the cortical area A, should be a lot bigger than cortical area for B? But remember, this is the motor cortex. So this is the part that allows that part of the body to move. Well, for obvious reasons, because you are not going to use your, for example, elbow to play the piano. You're not going to use your elbow to play the guitar. You're not going to use your elbow to do anything intricate or anything meticulous or anything that requires fine, meticulous movement, intricate movement. You're going to use your fingers and your hands. And because of that, you will need bigger parts of the brain so that you can carry those more intricate functions. Okay, so that's the reason. This whole idea, so this slide really talks about this idea of lateralization, as I told you before, the signals that come from your left side of the body. Okay, so this would be, for example, your left side is going to be switching and going to the right side of the brain, and the parts and the signals coming from the right side go switch and they get dealt with on the right side of the brain. So that's whole idea. It's called what we call left to right lateralization. By the way, again, this is the same thing as I said before. So this is the homunculus. This picture, guys, is called the homunculus or the little man. Same thing. And we show that here and on the cortex too. You can see the same thing here. So yeah, so this slide shows you what we call lateralization, which essentially, as you can see, switches the left and right. And again, this is true for both motor and sensory functions, right? But mostly for the sensory function. And we can actually test lateralization using different tests. So you can actually test your eye dominance by doing this. So if you actually look at this picture, you can actually try that at home. And then if you can see, you will find that for most people, you will see this picture a bit more clearly using one of your eyes, right? That would basically mean that your eye, um, if you're left-eyed, essentially, that um, probably your right, the signals coming from the sorry, if your left eye, the left part of the brain dealing with the eye is stronger. If you're right-handed, the right part of the brain dealing with your hand is stronger, right? So remember, the motor, when you write, you have to use the motor cortex. As you can see, here's your hand. That's the part that you use for writing. Now, remember, brain is bihemispheric. Bihemispheric, it's bilateral in nature, which means you're going to have two regions like that, both on the left and on the right side, right? We have the same thing on the right of the brain. And the question becomes, which cortex, the left or the right, is more dominant for your hand, insofar as writing goes? And if you're right-handed, that part of the brain or that lobe is stronger. But we also, when we look at different left and right brain, we also see differences in overall function. So for example, what we know is this is the right brain. This is the right brain. This is the right brain. So the right brain, as you can see, has to do with holistic functions, intuition, creation or creativity, artistic functions, and musical functions. When we switch to your left brain, you're thinking things like analytical, logical, scientific, mathematical, language functions. Okay. Uh, this doesn't mean that if you're a mathematician or a good scientist that your uh, right brain is not necessarily as strong. There are people who are good at arts as well as math, right? But you find that most people are dominant in one, not the other, and not the other, or not both. So, that's just a general trend. So usually either left brain or the right brain tends to be more dominant, um, right? Both from a somatosensory and motor perspective. And then in that case, that person, for example, may be better at science or logic or math compared to arts. Uh, so what we see here, guys, is essentially this whole idea of connection between two parts of the brain, left and right parts of the brain. So that would be, for example, the function of the commissural fibers. That's these fibers right here, as you can see, right? So this dotted line shows you the connection between left brain and the right brain. That's the function of these ones. We call them fibers. Those are, by the way, all white matter. So you're thinking axons, right? Essentially, you're thinking axons, myelinated axons. So there are a bunch of myelinated axons, which we call them fibers, and if they're commissural, they're the ones that connect left and right, because we want to have coordination, right? Remember, not a single part of the brain works in isolation. Every part of the brain works with other parts of the brain. So there must be connections between different parts of the brain, and these are the connections. Um, the associated fibers, number two, are the ones basically that connect the hemispheres between the lobes. So that would be these guys here. Okay, so maybe I should label them for you. So those are these ones. These are these guys. Okay. And finally, we have these ones here. Okay. So associated fibers are these ones. As you can see, they're connecting the lobes within the hemisphere, right? Remember, this would be your one hemisphere, this would be another hemisphere. Okay. If you look at the projection fibers, those are the ones that they connect different parts of the central nervous system. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Sorry, guys. That's not, this is, that's, these ones are associated fibers, and these ones are projection fibers, different parts of the central nervous system. So you can see you're going from the cortex, for example, to the spinal cord. Right? So again, commissural fibers connect left and right brain. Associative fibers or association fibers connect different lobes, and then projection fibers connect different parts of the brain. All right, so that's the summary of everything we discussed. You guys can give this one and read. We talked about that. Now let's talk about the deep nuclei of the brain. Okay, the parts of the brain which are deep. And so what this slide shows you guys is essentially um, the ventricles, which basically are located right in this gray area. Okay, um, sorry, this sort of greenish area, I should say. Um, so all of this, which as you can see, it says lateral 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are your ventricles. Um, and you can see that we're looking at the one on the left. We're showing you guys the medial view. The one on the right is showing you guys the lateral view. And the lateral view essentially means if you look at your deep brain, let's say from outside inwards, of the brain, right? So if I want to show you, so let's say this is, so let's say this is the anterior part of the brain, right? And let's just say this is the left hemisphere, LH. The deep nuclei would be somewhere here, correct? In blue, something like that. In this picture, you're looking, and this would be your ear, okay? Right? You're looking at the brain from the front. That's just one of the hemispheres. This is your left ear. If you look at your brain from this direction, if you look at your brain from this direction, this way, okay? If you look at your brain from this direction, yeah, through your ears, let's say, okay? You're going to see something like that. That's called lateral view. But if you look at your brain from the inside, still the same thing. Let me put that, where should I put it? Let me put it here and then I'll move it up in a sec. That if you actually look at the brain from the inside, the same thing. Let's say you go inside your brain and you look at it this way. Again, the blue is the deep nuclei. That's a deep nuclei. Essentially, it's this entire thing, this deep part of the brain. Then you get what we call the medial view. If we can put this somewhere, maybe here. There you go. So this is essentially what we call the medial view. That's called the lateral view. So that's basically what they mean by lateral medial view. You still have the same structures, obviously. This is supposed to be color coded, guys. Anything in this sort of light blue are your ventricles. So maybe I'll just add that here. Those are the ventricles. Anything in green is called the basal ganglia, which is in green. Anything in purple is basically your limbic system. That includes this little thing here or this thing here. These are all limbic system. And finally, the gray area is your thalamus. And this is your thalamus. So what's going on here? If you guys remember the deep nuclei, and I told you sometimes you include the thalamus, sometimes you don't, but we did say basal ganglia limbic system are parts of it. So that's essentially what you're talking about. You're talking about the thalamus, basal ganglia limbic system. But what's important is that the location of these deep nuclei, these deep parts of the brain, first of all, they're all co-localized to the same area, and they actually are just next to the ventricles, like third, second, and third ventricle. And you can see everybody is just housed together. So you really have ventricles, number one, thalamus, number two, basal ganglia, number three, and limbic system, number four. You have four structures, one, two, three, four structure, which they're all in the same area. And if you look at it from the side, you see this. If you look at it from the inside of the brain, you see something like that. Okay. Now, the anatomy is not important. You're not. I'm not going to ask you to label, like give you a picture like that and label. What you need to know are the following. First of all, these location, everybody is in the same area: ventricle, thalamus, basal ganglia, limbic system. That's the first thing you should know. The second thing you should know is the overall function of these parts. I already told you what ventricles do. Those are the ones that make you CSF, right? So cerebrospinal fluid. So that's good. Thalamus, we also discussed already. That's the part that used to focus on something. I think we're going to talk about thalamus again, but we already covered it once. And these are the functions of the basal ganglia, and these are the functions of the limbic system. So I'll let you guys read on the detailed notes here, but the overall function of the basal ganglia, guys, is a smooth movement. And it's the site that you use a lot of dopamine and dopaminergic receptors. That's what DAR means. DA for dopaminergic receptor, and this is dopamine. And if you remember, I said if you play piano, if you play the guitar, you're going to be using a lot of your basal ganglia. Or if you want to do fine movement, like maybe surgical procedures and whatnot, that's the side, that's the part of the brain which is heavily involved. You don't need to know at the anatomical parts of these structures. Just focus on their function. That's more important. So I guess I'll just highlight the function for you guys. So the smooth movement, as you can see, reward pathway and addiction pathway and dopaminergic sites. And you can see it's right outside the ventricles. Again, that's not as important. And then when we look at the functions of the limbic system, I want you to know that it's primarily responsible for emotion and memory. So limbic system, emotion, memory, basal ganglia, smooth movement, reward pathway, addiction pathway. Very important to understand those major functions for your test. And then this picture shows you the same thing. You still look at the deep nuclei, except from a different angle. In this case, they're looking at basal ganglia. Sometimes we call them basal ganglia. Sometimes we call them basal nuclei. Now, the ganglia thing is it's a bit of a misnomer, correct? Because to call them basal ganglia, the ganglia by definition belong to the peripheral nervous system, if you remember. Uh, so if you when you call them basal ganglia, it gives you this notion or that these must be in the peripheral nervous system. This is not part of the peripheral nervous system. So, you know, it's better to call them basal nuclei, but most people call them basal ganglia. You don't need to know this slide for the test. This is just showing you the anatomy or parts, or different parts of the basal ganglia. And I guess you kind of want to know what diencephalon. So diencephalon, as I mentioned before, it's essentially mostly hypothalamus, which we'll talk about soon. But yeah, this is just looking at the brain from the bottom part up. So let's say you're looking at your brain through your stomach. Let's say if you put your eye in your stomach and look up in your brain, you will see something like that. And that would be the front of the brain. That's the back of the brain. So I'm going to say this is not going to be on the test. Not on test. Basically, when you look at the thalamus function, they're trying to show you what thalamus does and how basal ganglia work together. Essentially, this slide shows you an example of how different parts work together. And the longest story is that once you have what we call, if there's any signal or anything happening in the brain, most of the time thalamus has to work as a gatekeeper. Um, for example, you kind of make a decision to do something here in the cortex, you come down, you tell the thalamus what's happening, thalamus then allows or disallows, in this case, it's inhibiting it actually. And yeah, so basically it just doubles down on the function of the thalamus. It's not that important. This is also, I'll just take that off the test too. But what you need to know, what you should know for future, I guess, is that the basal nuclei, basal ganglia have different parts, and that's the microanatomy of basal ganglia. You can see um, those here. And of course, the amygdala and the substantia nigra, those are part of the limbic system, which work with the basal ganglia to actually carry their own functions. It's important to understand that when we look at these deep nuclei, okay, this deep nuclei, that the uh, especially the basal ganglia and the limbic system always work together, always, always. Now, in other words, if you are somehow activating this part, you're going to inevitably activate or affect this part. Okay. By the same token, if you're working through the basal ganglia, you're going to be inevitably affecting your limbic system. Now, sometimes you stimulate both systems. Sometimes you're using them both directly. But let me give you an example. Let's say you are playing piano. And, for those of you who play music, you guys know this. The person who is playing it, they usually feel some feeling of satisfaction. They feel good about it. I mean, on average, most of the time, if not all the time. Well, guess what? When you play the piano, you're using a basal ganglia, which is next to the emotion part of your brain and memory part of your brain. And that's why usually, let's say when you play the piano, you feel you have this positive emotion, this sort of feeling good uh, going on in you, correct? Um, so that's one example. Sometimes you may play music and you're doing it, or you're doing something. It doesn't have to be music. You may be doing something, you or using your basal ganglia, and then that sort of brings some memories in the past. Or you may play a song and it may bring some memories in the past, or something like this. So um, that's basically that's definitely important to understand that these two parts work together. The other thing to understand is that it can go the other way around too. So if you're feeling absolutely sad, very, very depressed, very sort of under the weather, um, and very, if you're not feeling very well, then you're not probably going to be performing your best when you're playing the guitar or um, the piano, correct? You can understand that. Maybe not as good as when you're feeling good. Uh, or the same thing here. If your memory is damaged. So now remember, when let's say you memorize a song, let's say how to play. If you forget how to play the song, then probably you're not going to be playing it very well, right? So these two parts work together, and you can see that here as well. So this, what we call related structures, are the parts of the limbic system, LS, which work together with the basal ganglia. This one is also not on test. What these slides show you, essentially, they're trying to show you examples of how you use different parts of the brain and how there is connections between different parts. So this is an example. So for example, let's say you look at a bottle of alcohol. Okay, so that would be, let's say, a bottle of beer, and the first cue from your motor cortex is that, well, just do it, right? So you can see that circle goes to your brain and you decide to do it or not, right? And you decide to do it. And by the way, when you decide if you want to do it or not, that's this number one, guys. Number one would be right here. That's number one. That's the path. So you get a signal from your eye, you look at the beer, you make a decision in the back because you're analyzing the information here, right? Goes to your sensation area, thirst area. You may feel thirsty, or you may want to just drink, and then you decide to drink, even though you know that, oh, if I drink, I may actually get caught, or if I may kill myself, I may get drunk. But let's say you decide to drink. Once you decide to drink, your you will decide how to do it, right? So that would be part of the cerebellum. Are you going to use your hand to grab the bottle, or are you going to use, I don't know, if it's too far, you're going to use like a ruler or something to bring it closer to you. So you're going to use different parts of your body to do that, correct? And number three, you're going to be using your basal ganglia to how essentially manage or control your movement so that you don't drop the bottle or something like that. So again, that's just an example of how different parts work together. The limbic system, as long as you know that it has to do with emotions, which is a part of, which is a function of amygdala, emotions, as well as hippocampus, which carries long-term memory and learning, that's enough. Before the test, what you need to know about the limbic system is, and I already told you it has to do with emotion and memory. Now I want you to know the different anatomical parts, or the main parts responsible for that. The main anatomical part of the limbic system responsible for emotion and emotional memories or emotion is amygdala. The main anatomical parts responsible for long-term memory function of the limbic system is called the hippocampus. So please make sure you guys know those two structures. This slide basically shows different types of memory. And again, that's mostly for psychology. I will tell you that um, this part here is mostly for episodic memory, semantic memory, and procedural memory. And I'll give you some examples. So here the example would be an event. For example, this could be marriage. This could be graduation, right? It could be a ceremony. It could be a graduation event that you will always remember. That's, by the way, those are different types of your memory. Those of you who want to do psychology, you will see these for sure. different types of memory. Um, and by the way, we use different parts of the brain for each of these types of memories. Semantic memory is usually, for example, is this type of memory you use for studying and learning in a school. Essentially, that's the type of memory you need to do very well on the tests or exams. And then finally, procedural memories, which is essentially kinesthetic. So the example would be piano, surgery, things like that. If I teach you guys, so you guys, for example, learn how to make a suture, right, the other day, right? Or how to make an, that's, if you remember eventually how to make sutures and you kind of hopefully remember them forever, that's called, that would be a procedural type memory because it's a procedure. You learn how to do something. This is, you memorize stuff to write tests. It's mostly, there's no activity involved here most of the time. And then this is mostly for events. Of course, different parts of the memory can be integrated and they can be interrelated, but we can graph them or we can group them into these three types. You tend to not to forget this type the best. In terms of which one is the longest lasting type of memory, it's usually procedural. So, you're probably not going to ever forget how to swim. You're probably never going to forget how to ride the bicycle. Once you play piano, you're probably never going to forget. I mean, unless you don't play piano for like, I don't know, like 50 years or 20 years. Most likely you will remember forever. Once you learn how to do some surgical techniques, you will almost never forget. So doing things, it's something that um, you'll almost never forget. And I will tell you this sort of notion, um, this this idea of, if you remember, and I put that actually outside of the classroom. If you look at mm, the the board outside, I actually put that. Is this idea of learn one, teach one. That this is the short version of it, and finally do one. You know, why do I say that? Is that if you actually do this, for anything, it doesn't matter. You could be talking about learning a musical instrument. You may be talking about learning it studying for a test. It could be learning anything. Could be learning how to make a dish if you're in the kitchen. If you can learn it and then teach it to somebody, and finally, if you can do it, you will be guaranteed, most likely, most likely, never, never forget forever. Okay, so think of anything. Again, this could be biology. This could be an assignment. This could be a test. This could be riding the bicycle. This could be swimming. So now, for those of you who are going to be, by the way, the reason this is going to work is because you essentially use all of these types of memories, right? And you integrate them, and then this way you will never forget. And that's why it's very important for you guys to. I will have you guys do this in class, hopefully in the next few weeks, is to not just learn and study, but to be able to teach them and actually do them. Now, you don't get to actually do everything you learn. I guess that's the toughest part. But the first two, you can always try. You can always learn something and teach it to somebody else or explain to somebody else. That you will never forget. Okay. Diencephalon. So we are going to take a break, I guess, and we'll talk about diencephalon next. All right, so now we're going to talk about diencephalon. Okay, so diencephalon, as you can see here, it's a bit lower than the top brain, which was cerebrum, aka telencephalon, but it's still part of the forebrain. And we divide diencephalon into four substructures, which are thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland, pituitary gland. As I mentioned before, sometimes thalamus is part of cerebrum deep nuclei, sometimes people categorize thalamus as part of diencephalon. But for this course, you can use both ideologies, and as long as you understand the thalamus is really part of forebrain, that should be enough information. As I said in class previously, pineal gland and pituitary gland are also part of diencephalon, although technically these are also part of the endocrine system. In terms of their location in the brain, so you can see in this cartoon that thalamus is located here. Again, this is technically part of the deep brain, and then hypothalamus, which would be somewhere here, would be right below thalamus, hence the name hypothalamus. And this is the location of pineal gland, which is right there. And finally, you have the posterior pituitary gland. So yeah, I should mention that the pituitary gland here, is actually posterior, PG for pituitary gland, not anterior, PG. Okay, so the pituitary gland, which we'll finish talking about by the end of the lesson, is divided into two subsections, posterior and anterior. The posterior pituitary gland is part of the nervous system, but the anterior pituitary gland is actually exclusively part of the endocrine system. All right. So having said that, let's now talk a little bit about different parts of the diencephalon. Um, so again, be careful. This is only posterior, not anterior. So we're going to start with thalamus. We talked about thalamus before, which is, again, it's located right here. It's around the ventricles. It's also around where you can find basal ganglia and limbic system. Its function is essentially to act as a filter center, and it essentially allows you to selectively attend to a specific task or a thing. In other words, thalamus allows you to focus. In that it will filter unrelevant information and unnecessary information, so you can focus on one specific task. Hypothalamus, which is all this pink area, right? All of this pink space is hypothalamus, but you can see it has different parts, right? These little structures colored differently are subparts of hypothalamus. So what you need to know about hypothalamus function are essentially listed here. So as you can see, it has to do with autonomic nervous system regulation. So as I mentioned, this has nothing to do with generation of autonomic activity. Its function is to regulate or modify that. It also regulates pleasure, fear, range. We also can regulate temperature, appetite, as well as water intake and thirst regulation, and finally, a sleep and circadian rhythm. Uh, the regulation of the function of hypothalamus as it pertains to sleep regulation is in concert with the pineal gland as well. So this gland here, guys, which we call pineal, works with the hypothalamus together. They work together to basically essentially regulate sleep. The generation of a sleep rhythm or circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm essentially is a rhythm that basically generates our sleep pattern. It's originally generated by the pineal gland, or pineal gland is part of its sort of production. But from a regulation perspective, as you can see, hypothalamus is the one that does that. So it has mostly regulatory functions. And finally, it acts to regulate endocrine control as well. Posterior pituitary gland, so that's this structure here. Again, this part is what we call posterior PG. I'm just going to call it PG for pituitary gland. And this part in the front would be called anterior pituitary gland because it's in the front, and this is the posterior pituitary gland. Again, posterior pituitary gland is part of the nervous system. The anterior pituitary gland is not part of the nervous system, it's part of our endocrine system. Diving a little bit deeper with the thalamus and its function. So, as we said before, this is a center that our body uses to relay information. This could be both sensory, as you can see, sensory and motor, to the cerebral cortex, via thalamocortical fibers. And we saw that picture, by the way, here. So if you guys remember this, by these thalamocortical fibers, they mean all of these fibers here. This fiber, that fiber, that fiber. So we call them corticothalamic fibers or thalamocortical fibers because there are fibers that connect thalamo or thalamus to the cortex, hence cortical. But in terms of its function, in a more nuanced manner, I've listed them here for you. So it has to do with your memory, motor regulation, sensation regulation, and cortical input, and eventually functions to help you achieve selective attention. Insofar as the memory goes, it links memory bodies to cingulate cortex. You don't need to know these details, guys, by the way. This would be the most important part that you need to know from a functional perspective. From a motor perspective, as you can see here, determines balance between basal nucleus and cerebral output to the premotor cortex. From a sensation perspective, it allows you to essentially filter information which are coming sometimes from multiple sources, right? So as I mentioned before, if you want to shut down touch, pressure, proprioception, temperature, pain, and just focus on vision, for example, you can do that using the thalamus. Um, Here's a fun fact. So you may have experienced this for those of you who play any sort of sports or some group activity that involves physical motion. Sometimes when you're involved and focused on a sport and you're doing some physical activity, you may, after you finish the activity and you come home, you realize, for example, you've cut your finger, or you may realize after the fact that your nail is broken, or you may realize after the fact that your I don't know, there's like a bruise on your foot, and you may be like, when did that happen? Like, when did I cut my finger? Like, you somehow don't remember that you cut your finger, or if you cut your finger, I'm sure you can imagine there will be some pain associated with it. So if you right now cut a small part of your finger, um, obviously you'll feel some pain right away. You will notice that. But sometimes you look at your finger and like, when did I cut my finger? Um, that's because at the time, for example, that your finger was cut, the sense of touch and pain were completely closed off because of the thalamus. And this could be very well because of the fact that at the time you were involved with something which you were heavily involved with visually or auditorily, or maybe you were doing some activity that your thalamus had essentially shut down the sensation of touch and pain and pressure. So you didn't realize it at the time. So this whole sort of selective attention and filtering sensory input to your brain is the main job of thalamus. Um, from a anatomical perspective, so do realize that thalamus comes in pairs of structures. So just like any other structure in the brain, it comes in a pair. It has bilateral um, structure, and so we call those lats. So if you then look at each of these sort of, by the way, when we refer to thalamus, we're talking about the whole entire thing. So I just want to orient you here. So on the front, you have anterior side. In the back, let me just circle this one actually. So in the front, you have the anterior side. That's the front. In the back, you have posterior side. That's the back. That would be the back of your head. That would be the front of your head. Um, And so these would be lateral sides, and you can see this part is called medial. This part is called lateral. And so you can see you have lateral and medial parts of the thalamus, which have different functions. You also have posterior and anterior parts. Do you guys follow? So if you look at thalamus, you can actually divide it into four structures. Posterior, and this is all color for you, four structures or four substructures. Posterior, number one. Lateral in pink, number two. Technically, that's, sorry. Yeah. Posterior, number one. This pink area, number two. This green part, number three, which we call lateral thalamus. And then this sort of orange part, which we call anterior thalamus, number four. Okay, so posterior, medial, lateral, and frontal or anterior parts of thalamus. And of course, you have the same thing on the other side of the brain. So now let's talk about the brain stem. I told you before that brain stem essentially encompasses parts of what we call midbrain, plus parts of hindbrain. And there we go. So this is the part, the entire midbrain is part of the brain stem, as you can see here, as well as reticular formation pons and medulla oblongata of the hindbrain. You could say it's really hindbrain minus the cerebellum. Okay, so which is this part of the brain, by the way, that's called the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum right here. This whole thing. So you could say that essentially the brain stem involves these areas right here, which includes parts of it which are midbrain and parts of it which are hindbrain. And you can see that here too, right? So this is the midbrain area, and then this whole part is essentially hindbrain, right? So this would be midbrain, which we just mentioned, and then this whole part, which would be hindbrain. So the lowest part of your brain. And there's one part which you don't see, but that would be like a little canal right in the middle of this stem, which we call the reticular formation, which I'm going to show you, which is listed here, but you don't see it. So let me just draw it like that. So this would be the reticular formation. So those are parts of your um, the brain stem. Insofar as its function goes, collectively, you can see it has to do with, as you can see, initiating autonomic nervous system activity, right? And it also gives rise to all cranial nerves, which we'll talk about, right? But remember, technically, the cranial nerves become part of your peripheral nervous system, right? However, this part is technically part of your central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, part of your central nervous system. Okay, so we'll talk about the cranial nerves later, but let's actually dive deep into different parts of the brainstem. Guys, I'm going to highlight stuff here, and the ones that I've highlighted are the ones you need to know for the test. Don't worry about the other details, okay? Okay. The midbrain, so we're going to start with the midbrain, which is the first part here. And the midbrains has to do with what we call visual cortex or visual reflexes relay and auditory reflex relay. And those are those are functions of what we call superior and inferior parts or colliculi, sorry, or parts of the midbrain. So you could say that the midbrain has to do with these reflexes that have to do with your eyes and your ears. And we'll talk about that when we do the eye and the ear. I'm going to come back to the midbrain and you guys will see what they do. Do notice that your superior part has to do with your vision and the inferior part has to do with your auditory. Okay. So if you actually look at your your eyes in in a mirror. So this would be a mnemonic for you to help you memorize this. Your eyes are usually slightly higher than your ears, slightly. So look at yourself in the mirror next time, you will see it's a slightly higher, like the actual eyeball is slightly higher than the what we call the air canal, the auditory canal, or the hole in your ear. So you can use that to say, okay, the higher one or the more one, the one on the top is superior, and the one at the bottom is inferior. Superior is higher because your eyes are higher, and inferior is lower because your ears are lower. So you can actually use that to memorize. So that's midbrain, and these are the functions of the midbrain, by the way. So in this slide, we're not talking about medulla and pons, by the way. All of these functions are functions of the midbrain. So you can see it has to do with integration of sensory information, integration of visual auditory information, reflexes, wakefulness, consciousness, coordination of information for posture, muscle tone. This whole integration thing becomes a big deal. We will talk about that later on, and reflexes and wakefulness. That should be enough. So integration of information, reflexes, visual, audio-visual reflexes, and finally wakefulness and coordination of posture. That would be another coordination of posture. So those are the main functions of midbrain. Integrating information. Why? Because as I mentioned before, and I will just try that here, guys, the lateralization that I mentioned happens mainly in the midbrain area. Okay, so we will see that soon. And maybe we saw that here. Let me just go back and see if the lateralization was mentioned here. Yeah, so that's your midbrain, guys, essentially. It also happens in your thalamus, but it's mostly in the midbrain that happens. So let's go back here. Yeah, so that's what integration really means. But again, as long as you know the following, so integration of information, visual, audio-visual reflexes, wakefulness and consciousness, and coordination of movement and posture, that's enough for now, for the midbrain function. For the reticular formation, which is essentially this hole here in the middle of the brain stem, which is in the core of the brain stem, okay? This is the part that you use to basically allow for sleep, consciousness, cardiovascular control, pain modulation, habituation. I don't need you to know that. Just understand the reticular formation is right in the middle. It's like a canal, as you can see here as well, um, which allows for these neurotransmitters to go up and down. Um, Around it, you can see there is substantia nigra, which forms a lot of dopamine. You don't need to know that, and the red nucleus, which has to do with basic motor pathways. The important thing to understand is that a lot of your neurotransmitters, guys, the ones that we talked about, acetylcholine, adenosine, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, glycine. Most of them actually are formed. A lot of them, especially acetylcholine and dopamine, are formed in this area of the brain. For pons function, let's see. So pons, right, they're more inferior to the medulla, to the midbrain. So now we're talking about, as you can see, this area, this whole area of the brainstem. It has to do with regulation of ventilation, relay station between the brain. Of course, it has the relay section. Controlling anti-gravity, posture, and balance. Again, posture and balance are involved. Spinal cord to medulla, of course, to the upper region is a connection area, and relaying information again. So technically, that's number one. We don't need to know for number two. And some autonomic nervous system association. Guys, a short note. I'm not going to give you lots of questions. You probably won't get any questions with regards to specific functions of pons and brainstem relative to other parts of the brain. If I do give questions with regards to pons, I'll make sure that I'll practice them with you. But for now, focus on these highlighted functions here. Finally, we go one down and we have medulla, which is this part right there, which is this area right here. And by the way, all of this area, right, anything below that would be spinal cord, right? So what does the medulla do? So this would be a lot more important, by the way. So this is the control of involuntary functions. That's breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, deglutition, that's swallowing. Deglutition, the technical term for swallowing, digestion, emesis, which means vomiting. Essentially things that you have no control over, right? So when you breathe, as I mentioned, believe it or not, you don't really have control over breathing in, blood pressure, heart rate, deglutition. So medulla is very famous for involuntary control of some of these actions. Okay, so it does have to do with controlling reflexes such as coughing and sneezing. Um, it also has to do with relaying sensory information, and finally lateralization uh, of the motor neurons from the spinal cord input. Okay, so number 4 is important. Essentially, the fact that information coming from the spine, they switch. So if this is, let's say this is the left side, okay, going this way, and that's the right side. So when the left information come, they actually switch. They go up this way, something like that in the medulla. That's really what that means. And same thing here for the right information, they switch in medulla, they go up and they go to your brain. Cerebellum, which is this part right here, that's the part that has to do with essentially bulk movement of function. So bulk movement. So cerebellum. I do use the example of cats. I also use the example of if you're a gymnast, gymnastics. So think of people who basically do those crazy aerobatic sort of movements in the air, on the ground. So that's the part of the brain that regulates that type of movement. If you play karate or taekwondo or some sort of martial arts, same thing. So this will not be on the test. This is just for information. It shows you another example of how we used our cerebellum to function. Again, not a single part of the brain works in isolation, and that includes cerebellum. Cerebellum, let's say, if you want to balance yourself, right? You do need visual inputs, as you can see. It comes from your superior, if you remember, superior geniculate, so superior colliculus of the midbrain. Right? This is so if you want to stand still or make sure you have a balance, you can imagine that you keep moving your eyes so that you can keep a nice balance. You also use your vestibular sense, but the vestibular sense is part of the balance sensation that comes from your ears, actually. We'll talk about that when we talk about ears. Essentially, what this means is that you also use your ears to keep your balance. And proprioception, which is the sense of balance coming from your muscles. Okay, so I will mention that this has to do with your ears. This has to do with your muscles. Okay, so of course use your muscles, which you can see the signals coming from the bottom part, from the spine. Of course, use your eyes and your ears. And finally, ultimately, you have to use your frontal cortex to make a decision as to where you want to move your hand, where you want to move your leg, where you want to move your hips. Right? So we can think about gymnasts, a cat, for example, falling on their legs, also ice skating or ice dancing. I don't know if that's a correct name, but you guys know what I'm talking about. The people who dance on ice, those couples, uh, right? So that it's a very integrative system, right? So the cerebellum gives us that leverage, but it doesn't work alone. It works with cortex, it works with our eyes, it works with our ears, it also works with our muscles to eventually keep us nice and balanced. Okay, so we're going to take a break, and now we're going to talk about peripheral nervous system. Okay, everybody, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. As I told you guys before, peripheral nervous system essentially is a bunch of mixed nerves, right? And mix here means that you have both afferent and efferent, right? This means that you have both afferent, which are plus efferent nerves, right? And so when we look at a nerve, which as you can see here is this one is one nerve, right? That it's actually two branches on each side. So we can see that this part, it turns out that the sensory nerves, right? So that would be the afferent ones are entering from the back side. Remember, that's the dorsal side of the spinal cord or the back side, and the efferent nerves are coming from the front. So far, so good. So, um, and as you can see here, they're separated very close to the spinal cord, but they kind of merge inside here, and they become mixed nerves at this point. There are two ganglia in this picture, and by the way, we have the same thing on this side, right? So that would be the afferent branch, and this one would be the efferent nerves, the efferent neurons. And what's interesting is that you also have these two substructures which we call ganglia. So I'm gonna put that here, label that here and here. There's also other ganglia here and here, right? That essentially what we have here, guys, is first of all, these are called dorsal root ganglia, DRG. That's your DRG or dorsal root ganglia, which we saw before. We call these ones sympathetic ganglia. Sympathetic ganglia, same thing. Sympathetic ganglia. So sympathetic ganglia, and then here you can see there's a pair of dorsal root ganglia. So the fact that we use the term dorsal, D for dorsal, so again, DRG stands for dorsal root ganglia. By the way, hopefully you guys remember, ganglia means a bunch of soma in the peripheral nervous system. So you would expect bunch of somas here, bunch of somas here, bunch of somas here, bunch of somas here. And the fact that we call them dorsal, is because these ganglia belong to the afferent neurons or sensory neurons, which take signals to the dorsal part of the spinal cord. Okay, so dorsal in the back, afferent, dorsal. And remember, your afferent are your sensory neurons, right? Afferent means sensory. Okay, so don't forget, afferent means sensory, yeah, and then efferent, means exiting, it means motor neurons. These are the neurons which bring the signals in. I guess maybe I'll just add an arrow here. They enter the spinal cord here, and they exit this way. Enter this way, enter this way, exit this way. And you may be saying, Arash, do they just circle in the spinal cord and they go back out? Well, remember, if they do, that would make them a reflex. It would make the system a reflex, like come in, go to the spine and go out. But normally what happens is once the signals come in, they go up to the brain, they get processed, they come down, and then they exit, right? They enter in the back, go up through the tracts, get processed in the brain, come back down, and they exit from the efferent neurons. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of the whole entire peripheral nervous system, right? So let's dive into details. First of all, as you can see, they're showing a dorsal root ganglia here, which I already did for you, right? Again, that's the dorsal part, which basically goes in the backside. We also have, you don't need to know about dorsal ramus and ventral ramus. So whatever I highlight, guys, try to memorize that. And then, of course, we have sympathetic ganglia. So if you're wondering what these are, which is the same thing I drew here and here, those are basically your the collection of soma that belong to the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, your sympathetic nervous system is a branch of your motor nervous system. So it turns out that their somas are all collected at these ganglia. This is supposed to be your spine, which we're going to divide into 4 sections, right? So if you remember, this part would be essentially mostly cranium on the top. Cranial, that's basically anything coming out of your head. Let's say this area would be something like, by the way, that's a rough sketch, okay? I think they have a detailed picture somewhere here. But you guys follow this picture, but anyways, doesn't matter. This is a rough estimate of the branches. So anyway, this is called cervical, and you have thoracic, and you have lumbar, and finally you have sacral, something like that. Sacral. So these 4 parts, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, those are part of your spinal cord. Remember, the cranial nerves are technically coming out of your head. When you look at the the signal, spinal cord itself, it's made out of millions of axons, which we call, as we can see, afferent or sensory, voluntary efferent motor, and then autonomic efferent, which are basically um, also technically motor, but they're autonomic. Now, these are what we call postganglion and sympathetic ones, which we will talk about these ones later. For now, just focus on these two. Uh, this is basically this, guys, is basically these ones here, right? So because your motor branch, which is this part, this is your motor branch, is 2 parts. The motor branch of the nervous system has 2 parts, voluntary, involuntary. You also have 2 sub-branches of sensory. Remember, we have autonomic and somatic, but we don't really differentiate or distinguish those two in sensory branch. Here's a picture of an actual nerve, right? So if this is a nerve right here, let's say that's a nerve. Those are the orange plastic thingies sticking out in the market in the classroom. And when you open it up, you see something like that. And then when you open those, when you zero in on those structures, you see something like that. And eventually you'll see that you have either unmyelinated and or myelinated types of neurons or axons, right? So you can see it's made out of millions of, as it says here, millions of axons. And spine nerve, that's one nerve. That's one nerve. One nerve will have millions of axons, and these axons are shown here, right? Some of those axons are myelinated, such as the ones for motor, touch, pressure, proprioception. Proprioception, guys, is a sense of balance. The ones for temperature and pain are not myelinated. Okay, so diving a bit deeper now. So remember, we have to think about the brain too, right? Correct? If you think about the brain itself, of course, the brain has to be involved in almost all of the decision making. If that's the brain right here, the idea here is that once the signal comes in the back door, that's the dorsal area. It has to go up. We can see if you follow the blue arrow, those are all sensory, right? It comes up, that's a sensory tract, it goes in the brain, gets processed, and then in the red, that's your motor axon, okay? And we call them descending because they come down. These are ascending because they go up. And once it comes, it enters from the ventral arm. So it's going out this way now. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And once it goes out, it basically merges to become one mixed nerve. If it's a motor that has to do with your sympathetic nervous system, it would form its ganglia here, right? And finally, so these are what we call ventral root motors. You don't need to know that. The ones which I would highlight here would be descending motor neurons and then ascending sensory ones, and just understand that here you get mixed nerve. On this side, they're showing you the gray matter, white matter, which we already talked about. This is not going to be on the test. It's a slide. This basically shows you spinal cord tracts. Okay, so just for information. The blue here, guys, they're all stuff that basically are sensory. So everything in blue is sensory. These tracks, by the way, we're talking about the ascending tracts. So do you guys remember this blue arm here? Basically, they're saying that when you look at different types of axons of sensory, you get all these different types. Do you follow? When you look at the motor ones, you get these ones here. Okay, so they're saying that different types of so descending motor tracts, and there's different types of ascending tracts. Remember, tract is the analogous term used in the central nervous system that represents a collection of axons. Do you guys remember your first slide? So tract is the same thing as a nerve, except this one is peripheral nervous system. This one is central nervous system. So when it says tracts, they're basically talking about a bunch of axons, which are sensory or motor, and you can see that division in the spinal cord. Now, the idea is that the spine is nicely organized. So you can see some of them, or the tracts which are related to the pain and temperature, are all collected together. The ones that are related to light touch are co-localized in the ventral area. The ones in the dorsal one are mostly for deep touch, proprioception, vibration. That's essentially the categorization, sort of compartmentalization of different tracts in the spinal cord. Same thing for the motor ones, the ones that deal with your corticospinal, the motor ones of the of this region are called lateral corticospinal. These ones are called ventral corticospinal. So, um, yeah. All right. So, what about the nerves themselves? So, as I said to you here, we talked about different parts of the spine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys about the nerves of the cranium, the nerves that come out of the cranial area, the nerves that come out of here, the nerves that come out of here, the nerves that come out of here, and the nerves that come out of here. So let's do that. In your cranial section, so all of this slide here, the whole thing is, guys, has to do with the cranial nerves, right? This whole slide shows you all the cranial nerves. Those are the nerves that are coming from of the cranium. Essentially, that's your brain stem, by the way, which is within the skull, hence the name cranium. So if you look at the brain stem, as we said before, of course, it has pons, medulla, the midbrain, all that stuff. But as we said before, if you remember, we said that here. We said that right here in this slide. Then look at the brainstem. This one says brainstem also gives rise to all cranial nerves coming out of the tree. Okay, so from all three parts, essentially midbrain, pons, medulla. Out of all of these parts, so essentially there's nerves coming from the midbrain, there's nerves coming from the pons, there's nerves coming from the medulla. We call all of them cranial nerves, and they all come from the brain stem. So far, so good. So here they are. These are all the cranial nerves. And you don't need to memorize those names. There's only a couple that I want you to know, which I'll talk about. Um, so what do we need to know again? These are all cranial nerves. There's 12 pairs. You don't need to know the number. Sometimes 13, but whatever. And so that's the beginning of the spinal cord, by the way. What I want you to know for the test in terms of the cranial nerve number. So you can see this is number 1, 2, 3. Do you guys see that? 4, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I know the position is different, but that's how it is. So make sure you know 1. Let me use different color here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is 6 actually. So your eye actually gets 3 and 6. And then of course it keeps going. So 6, 7, right? V double I is 7, triple I is 8, and so on and so forth. So essentially, and that's 9. This one is 10, 11, 12. Okay. So 9, 10, 11, 12. So which ones I want you to know? I'm going to highlight them. I want you to know the ones for your eye, okay, which have to do with 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 6. Okay. So 2, 3, 4, oops, 4, and 6. 2, 3, 4, and 6. Right? And all of them have to do with your eye. Now, the optic nerve, okay, is number 2. So make sure you know that's optic nerve. That's the one that allows you that essentially allows you to see. To see. You follow? Guys, the third, fourth, and 3, 4, and 6, those ones, they allow your eye to move. Eye movement. You follow? There are muscles around your eye, as you can see, that allow your eye moves. Right now, when you're looking at the screen, if I do this, or if I do this, or if I do this, you're following the X, right? Which means your eye is moving. The reason your eye can move is because of these nerves, 3, 4, 6, which allow your eye to move through these muscles around your eye. So the only one that allows your eye to, or allows you to see, is optic nerve 2 or cranial nerve 2. Sometimes we call them CN. So if you see something like, for example, you may see CN. Later on, you will see CN2. Okay, that means cranial nerve number 2. C cranial, N for nerve, and 2 for 2. So this is CN2. CN3, 4, and 6 have to do with eye movement. You don't need to know the actual. So these are the name of the muscles, by the way. Aptocines, trochlear, and so don't worry about the names, just know the number. So 3, 4, 6 make your eye move, and number 2 actually allows you to see. So far, so good. I want you to know the trigeminal nerve, which is nerve number 5. Yes, I will call it. We call them trigeminal because, as you can see, it branches into 3. Do you guys see that? 1, 1, 2, and 3. Uh, Basically, if this nerve is damaged, all of these muscles are going to uh, be jeopardized or compromised. There is something else called referred pain, which I'll talk about later. Sometimes you may feel pain in this muscle, but you may actually So, oh, sorry, the pain may come from this muscle number one, but you may actually feel the pain in number three, something like that, because, and we call that referred pain. But the trigeminal nerve actually feeds in three muscles in your face on the side. You don't need to know the facial ones. You don't need to know these glands and so on, the tongue and the nose. I want you to know this one, number eight, cranial number eight, CN8. That allows you to hear and feel balanced. That's two things. The cochlear branch is actually two nerves. You can see if you can look carefully, there's two nerves coming in. This part, you can see it says vestibulocochlear, right? So this part is what we call, let me highlight this way. There's this part, right? Do you follow? So this part is, as you can see, coming this way, and then this part, and they merge at this point. So it turns out this part is called cochlea. So this part would be the cochlear nerve, and then this part is called the vestibule. So this part is called the vestibulo, and that's why we called, and you can see that the two nerves merge. So there's only one nerve here that we need to know, and that's called vestibulocochlear nerve, or CN8 sometimes, or CNV triple I. Okay, by the way, that's your ear. This is called the inner ear. Don't need to know number 9. Number 10 is very important. It's called the mighty vagus nerve or cranial nerve number 10. And this nerve is the one of the primary nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system. Do you follow? And so we will talk about this later on when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system. But this is very important. So number 9, and you don't need to know 11 and 12. Okay. So yeah, so understand these nerves and how they relate to different parts of your body. That's strong. Okay. Um, so those are your cranial nerves. Then we have, so those are 12 pairs, right? Then we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So that's, again, technically, remember, these are all part of your peripheral nervous system, except one is coming from the cranium, and these come from the spine. And as I said, we have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. The coccygeal is technically part of sacral. We'll talk about that in a second. Here's what I want you to know. For sure, understand cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. Those are the main 4 parts, right? So this part here, right? This part here, lumbar and sacral. You don't need to know the numbers. Don't worry about 8, 12, 5, 5. You don't need to know that. What you do need to know is, by the way, do you remember when I talked to you about the baby's neck? And I said, you got to be careful not to break the baby's neck, because if you do, you'll damage the plexus. That plexus is called brachial. It's called brachial because it goes to the brachial part of your bones here. You can see it basically, it senses, controls your whole entire upper limb. So if you damage that, then you damage the limbs or the hands. Upper limb means hands. So hands, arms, right? Okay, so you don't need to know the number. Do know the order. So first cervical, second thoracic, third lumbar, fourth sacral. And finally, what I want you to, and there's this plexus here, which we don't need to worry about. Sometimes there's overlap. You can see L, lumbar to S. By the way, if somebody shows you T1, they're talking about thoracic nerve number 1. That's what T1 means, right? So L2, for example, it means lumbar. That's one example. Lumbar nerve number 2. S4 means sacral nerve number 5, something like that. What I want you to know is this. Remember we talked about parasympathetic, sympathetic branches of nervous system? So I want you to know that the thoracic and lumbar, the thoracic and lumbar are what make up what we call sympathetic include sympathetic motor nerves. Do you follow? Okay, right? Or the efferent nerves. Now, maybe I should call them efferent. Okay, so thoracic and lumbar. And then sacral includes parasympathetic. Efferent nerves, but that includes including cranial nerve number 10. Do you follow? So only one nerve, so that's X, CNX. So what happened? Guys, I know this sounds a bit CNX. So what's going on? Your parasympathetic nervous system, that's the system that, remember, calms you down, essentially gets its nerves from the sacral parts. So you don't need to know which parts exactly, but the sacral portion, right? So there are a few nerves here, and there's just one nerve coming from the cranial. Now, you may be saying, that's very few, but actually what happens to the vagus nerve is this, guys, watch. This is a very thick nerve. It actually branches into many, 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 many nerves. Fun fact, this nerve, guys, branches into dozens of nerves that each innervate different organ: lungs, heart, stomach, large bowel, small bowel, the ears, your throat, your eyes, everything. Okay, so that's very important to understand is this vagus nerve comes out and it becomes many small nerves, and alongside the sacral nerve, the two of them, these two make up your parasympathetic branch, and then the thoracic and the lumbar make up your sympathetic nerves. In other words, the cervical has nothing to do here, and the coccygeal is irrelevant. So cervical, coccygeal they don't take part in the parasympathetic sympathetic idea. These couple of slides are not going to be on the test. Not on test. Also not on test. But don't worry about these two. Read them through. Basically, what they're trying to say is that the somatosensory nerves. So these are, remember, these are sensory. These are the ones coming in. You follow? These are the ones coming in the dorsal in the back part. They can be touch, pressure, pain, blah blah blah, and you can see they're just showing you that. And finally, and they're saying that their dendrites are here, and then finally their soma is in the back, hence making dorsal root ganglia. So I guess which is something I already told you. They're saying that the soma are located in DRG of these sensory ones, which is right here. DRG. And they highlighted that here for you. Right? Here, and here. And then they're saying that dorsal root ganglia, what exactly are these? So these are bundled together, blah, blah, blah. They're explaining all the details, which again, we don't need to know for the test. All right, so I will just read them through for you. So But again, you don't worry about memorizing them. So number one, DRGs are bundled of somatic and autonomic sensory neurons. So it includes both somatic and autonomic sensory. Remember, sensory has two branches. Located in the dorsal portion of the spinal cord, there is a pair of DRG on every spine, which we mentioned, for every spine segment. They form a chain of long dorsal aspect vertebral column. They are protected by the vertebral column, so protected by the actual bone, but outside the meninges. Makes sense because meninges were the layers to protect the central nervous system. Here we're talking about peripheral nervous system. They're outside of central nervous system, which we mentioned. Their axons extend into the central nervous system, of course, and they can synapse by the by the by the neurons here. So you can see that um, again, that's the soma, that's the axons, and they meet in the back. We did talk about descending and ascending roots. So I'm not going to talk in too much. The blue areas are ascending sensory motor, mostly dorsal, sorry, and descending ones are motor and mostly ventral, as you can see, mostly in the front. These are mostly in the back, uh, relatively, right? I mean, this is somewhere in here. They all innervate skeletal muscles and use again, we talked about these before. So skeletal muscles and use acetylcholine, and their somas are either in the brain stem or ventral horn. Again, you don't need to know that information. We already discussed them briefly before. That's called the ventral horn. Okay, that's the spinal cord, or you may have somas in the brain. Here's a picture of a mixed nerve again, mixed spinal nerve, which is made out of motor and sensory. Technically, we already showed you this picture, so nothing new here. Reflexes already discussed how they work. Reflexes work in a way that they're autonomic and they bypass the brain. I think that's the most important thing to understand. This specific one is called the patellar tendon reflex. Um, you don't need to know the mechanism of reflex for this course. There are different ones that you can see here, again, not on test. Also not on test. As long as you know what a reflex is, that's fine. You can see there's different types of reflex. You can see here we have the brachioradialis tendon reflex, tricep reflex, biceps brachial reflex, patellar tendon reflex, which is this one here in the top, and Achilles tendon reflex. And you can see you can put a hammer here, right? Or here, or in the elbow, on the back of your tricep. This is the front of your bicep, or you can put it on your wrist, essentially. And by the way, these arrows here, guys, you see these arrows? Those are the direction of the response, if that reflex works. So in other words, if you put a hammer, if you stimulate the person here, their knee, their fingers go back. If you hit them here, their leg goes this way. For the bicep, it goes this way. For the tricep, it goes this way. For the wrist, it should go this way. Something like that. But you don't need to know for this. All right, so we're going to take a break and then we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the section about autonomic nervous system. So this system, first of all, as we mentioned, is a phrase we use to really describe the motor arm. This is mostly the motor arm of the nervous system. This does not mean that we do not have autonomic sensory system, because we do. We talked about that before, right? So um, when we, for example, talked about the dorsal root ganglia, here we said that these dorsal root ganglia bundles belong to both somatic and autonomic sensory neurons, right? So the sensory system does have, here's a sensory system or sensory neurons. It does have autonomic branch. It's just that we don't really distinguish between the sensory somatic branch and the autonomic branch. But when it comes to the motor system, the execution system, we do differentiate between, um, we do profoundly differentiate between the autonomic and the somatic branch. The somatic branch, remember, essentially almost exclusively innervates the skeletal muscles. Those are the muscles that are attached to our bones. And an autonomic branch of the motor system um, is very different. That's all I'm going to say at this point. So yeah, so when we say the autonomic nervous system, there's no notion here just by looking at the name that we were talking about the motor arm. But again, just simply because we kind of don't care as much about the autonomic sensory system, that when we use the term the autonomic, or when we use the phrase of autonomic nervous system, really we're talking about the autonomic motor nervous system and not the sensory one. Uh, the other thing I want to mention is that the short form of this is going to be ANS. Hang on just 1 second. Okay. Um, which is basically subdivided into, hopefully you guys didn't lose my voice. I just realized my AirPods were disconnected. So basically what I was saying was that the autonomic nervous system, we don't really use the term motor in it, just because when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, we are by default talking about the motor arm, and we don't really care as much about the autonomic sensory system. So when we say the autonomic nervous system, we really mean the autonomic motor nervous system. Having said that, this system is subdivided into two systems of sympathetic and parasympathetic arms. Sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we're going to discuss next. But before we sort of divide the autonomic nervous system into its sympathetic, parasympathetic arms, let's kind of get an overview of what this system is about. So this is a branch of our nervous system that controls our involuntary muscles, like the heart and the smooth muscles. And for this reason, it's sometimes called the visceral motor nervous system, right? Again, visceral means core, motor because it allows those organs, these end organs, to move, hence the term motor, and nervous system. There's also a sensory part, which I just discussed a second ago, made of visceral afferent nerves of the system, but it's largely ignored, as I mentioned. It's not necessarily of interest. And so, except in regards to referred pain, which we'll talk about, and interoceptors, which we'll briefly talk about at the end. The most important role of the autonomic nervous system is to maintain homeostasis, internal homeostasis of things such as blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate. So I'm going to highlight that as blood pressure, but it includes also things like heart rate, respiratory rate, RR, um, dilation of our eyes, so our eye pupil, enlargement or constriction, and things of that nature. Digestion, for example, defecation, things like that, urination, so on and so forth. The fundamental aspects of the autonomic nervous system are as follows. Most visceral organs, right, have both innervations of visceral motor input, and some have only one. So most of them, I guess maybe I should do this. So most visceral organs have both. Some of them have only one. In other words, most of them have both sympathetic, parasympathetic, but some only have one type of innervation. The heart has both, and so does our gastrointestinal tract. That's our digestive system. The heart has both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervations. As you can see here, so that's our heart. And then here we have the GI tract. As we can see, with regards to heart, we have the sympathetic input leads to both tachycardia and positive inotropic effect, and the parasympathetic input leads to both bradycardia and negative inotropic effect. Okay, so um, but by the way, what tachycardia, bradycardia refer to are heart rate, and this sort of inotropic effect has to do with how forceful our heart can pump. Okay, so we do want to mention that maybe in the next slide. So when it comes to the heart, when it comes to our heart, okay, that so that's our heart right here. Um, Really, what we see here with regards to the heart is that, and let me just draw the balls as well. Let me do that. And here we have so when it comes to our heart, what's important to realize is that the heart can beat fast or slow. The heart, just make this a bit bigger. The heart can beat, or the heart rate, how fast the heart beats. This is basically measured as heart rate. And if it goes up, heart rate, and by the way, this is also called chronotropic effect. Okay, so I'm going to call this CE. And here we're going to have positive CE, positive chronotropic effect. And you can also have negative chronotropic effect. If you get positive chronotropic effect, the heart rate goes up, and we call that tachycardia. If you get negative chronotropic effect, the heart rate drops down, and we call that bradycardia. So far, so good. Cardia. When we look at the heart, heart as a muscle. When we look at the heart in terms of its, uh, in terms of how forceful it can beat, because it can also change how strong the heart beats or contracts. And that's what we call inotropic effect. Let's just call it IE. And when it comes to IE, again, you can have what we call we can have what we call positive inotropic effect and negative inotropic effect and negative inotropic effect. So the heart basically can beat very forcefully. That's called the force of contraction. That's the force of contraction. This one is the speed of its contraction. And when we refer to the sympathetic parasympathetic system, as you can see, both systems can actually affect how fast or slow the heart beats. So far, so good. And that's very important to realize. When it comes to the gastrointestinal system, you can see the sympathetic input yields relaxation. The sympathetic input yields relaxation. Parasympathetic input yields increases activity. Um, Now, the effect of the sympathetic nervous system overall is to turn you up, make you superactive or hyperactive. But there are some, and so most of the effects on its specific organs becomes pretty intuitive for the students to figure out. For example, if I tell you that sympathetic nervous system turns you up and makes you hyperactive, and I ask you, what do you think this system does on the heart rate? Most students can argue that, well, the heart rate must go up, or tachycardia, or you can get tachycardic. And by the same token, you can argue that if you're super active and running around and you're sort of hyperactive, that you're not going to have time to eat or enjoy food or sit down and have a nice lunch because you're super active and stressed and hyped up. And so your sympathetic nervous system then sort of slows down or relaxes the gastrointestinal tract, which is your digestive system. So it becomes pretty intuitive for most systems. Some systems are not that intuitive. Nonetheless, the heart and the GI tract are two examples of organs where both systems are present. And if you're asking, well, at a given time, which system would be more dominant? Well, it depends on the organ. And we'll see those differences later on. There are organs, as mentioned here, that only are innervated by one system, not the other. So one example is visceral arterioles. So visceral, as you can see, visceral arterioles only have sympathetic input, whereas the iris of the sphincter only have parasympathetic input. And we'll talk about the sphincter of the iris muscle in the eye, in the ear and the eyes class. The radial muscle of the eye, on the other hand, only has sympathetic innervation, radial muscle. A sphincter muscle's job is usually to constrict things. As you can see, this muscle constricts the pupil. Radial muscles, they increase the radius. So these ones, they actually dilate the pupil. You can understand that under sympathetic activation or hyperactivation, that because you have to be hyped up and super active and super alert, that you want to be able to have maximal vision. In other words, you want to have your pupil to be maximally widened out or large or enlarged. And that's exactly what this muscle does upon being activated by the sympathetic nervous system. It dilates the pupil, which is the part of your eye that allows light to come in. This way you have a better, more clear vision because you're hyperactive and stressed and under fight or flight conditions. So yeah, I think you should try to make those arguments for yourself when you try to memorize some of these outcomes, and as opposed to just merely memorize them. Try to come up with a story as to why your pupil has to dilate, or why would your pupils dilate under sympathetic input. So and you can kind of figure out the reason behind that, then you will never forget. You can actually guess what response to an organ will be given what type of input it has. And as I said, most of the outcomes on these different organs are pretty intuitive for most students. Okay. Mhm. Okay. Let's move on to input from one branch of the autonomic system is dominant in one organ? Yeah, so the organs that have both, the ones that have both that are innervated by both systems, usually one system is more dominant. In the case of the heart, there are both branches, but the sympathetic nervous system is dominated. So in the case of the heart, it's the sympathetic nervous system that dominates, as opposed to the parasympathetic nervous system. The um, the GI tract, however, the GI tract is the opposite. It's the parasympathetic nervous system which is dominant. Okay, so it depends on the organ, and you have to kind of memorize that. There's a clicker question here, which I encourage you guys to think about. The question reads, what would happen if a sympathectomy were performed on the heart, i.e. all sympathetic nervous inputs were stopped? So sympathectomy, guys, ectomy usually means removal, right? So gastrectomy, or you may hear appendectomy. That's where you remove your appendix. So ectomy means you remove sympath means sympathetic nervous system. So you're trying to remove your sympathetic nervous system, as you can see, it says here. Option A says increase in heart rate, blood pressure, decrease in heart rate and blood pressure, an unpredictable change in heart rate and blood pressure, an increase in heart rate and decrease in blood pressure, decrease in heart rate and increase in blood pressure. So think about that and let me know what you think. Second question is, remember the sympathetic job here was to increase heart rate and increase the force of contraction, or in this case, increase blood pressure. So sympathetic nervous system's job is to increase heart rate and increase blood pressure. The question is, what would happen if you got rid of the sympathectomy? Um, Next question says, if all autonomic inputs to the heart was stopped, okay, so if now you remove both, if you remove all autonomic input were stopped, then what would happen to the heart rate and force of contraction? By the way, if you're wondering how this can happen when you do heart transplant. Example in heart TX. TX in medicine means transplantation. So heart TX or HTX sometimes written. It means heart transplantation. When you get a new transplant, new heart from somebody else, obviously you cut or remove the innervations when you procure the heart, when you dissect the heart out of the recipient and the donor out of the donor, sorry. And once the recipient gets the heart, remember the recipient's sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system cannot innervate the new heart. So that would be an example of this situation. Anyways, so what would happen if you have no innervation? The heart rate would stop, heart rate would decrease, and the force of contraction would increase. Heart rate would fall, and force of contraction would fall. There would be no net change in rate and force of contraction. So look that up. All right, so the next few slides are actually very important for you to understand before we get into sensation and the eyes, yeah, the visual system. So what I will do, because these next few slides may be a bit confusing, I want to give you guys my own sort of take on that before we move on. So what we will do in the next few slides is to show you, we're going to be showing you the sort of the pathway of the nerve signaling as it pertains to the autonomic nervous system and the branches of autonomic nervous system. Okay, so you guys remember, so this was our, if this is, let's say this was our, let me try to draw it like that actually. So you guys remember that we would have, let me draw, something like that, right? So if you remember, and we had the same thing here, which I'm not going to draw. If you remember, this would be our dorsal side. This would be our ventral side. You guys remember that, let me just put that here, that here the signal will go in. That would be afferent sensory. And here the signal will go out, efferent motor. And then here we would have the mixed nerve, right? So first and foremost, we are going to be only talking about, for the next few slides, we're only going to be talking about the motor region. Okay, we're only going to be interested in the motor arm. Right. Remember, for the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system, we have nothing to do with the afferent sensory ones. We're only interested in a motor situation. Remember, parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system are technically motor branches of the nervous system. So we're only going to be focusing on that. Now, when you only look at this part, guys, so watch this, and remember, of course, we would have. I'm going to put an arrow. I'm going to call this effector organ, right? The motor arm is sending signals to something, to some organ, right? So now when we look at the differences between what we call autonomic nervous system, and what we call somatic motor nervous system, that this green part, this arm here, is actually, I'm going to draw that using a green thing, is actually only is actually only is actually only what we call a one neuron system. Okay, so what am I showing you here? Let me just show you like that. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that this neuron. So imagine you have one neuron here. Remember, we have millions of them. But imagine if I just take one. What I'm saying is that the neuron that starts this message from the spinal cord to the effector organ. Okay, so let's call this EO, effector organ. Effector organ, EO. Effector organ essentially is the organ that gets the signal from the motor arm. So that would be a motor neuron. Is a one motor neuron system. So you have your spinal cord, one motor neuron, effector organ, one, one. When we look at the same thing let me just try to separate this up a bit. When we look at the same thing under the autonomic nervous system, completely different ballgame. And guys, watch the screen for me for a sec. So I'm going to actually make a little code here, right? So instead of having one neuron, here we say that we have a two neuron system. That's it, right? So again, we are only talking about the motor arm. Here in the autonomic branch, you have two neurons back to back, two consecutive neurons, one, two. Here we have a one neuron system. So one, two, one. Okay, so one neuron, two neurons. And this, by the way, this is true for both sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? So that's why I wrote autonomic nervous system. And because we have two neuron system, we have two ganglion, or this technically is a ganglion, is also a ganglion, right? So we call this preganglionic, preganglion, and we call this neuron post ganglion. okay? And EO is the effector organ. And that's exactly what we are showing you here in this slide, guys. So what I'm showing you here at the top is the somatic nervous system. This one is a somatic nervous system, as you can see right here. It says somatic motor right there. And then down here, you're looking at the autonomic motor nerve. Here's a one neuron system. This one is a two neuron system. If you look closely, there's one here. That's the second one. Uh, so that's the first difference that you will see that exists between the somatic branch and the autonomic branch. The other difference is that the end organ for the somatic branch is almost exclusively skeletal muscles. And I've said that a few times already. The organs that the somatic motor neurons typically innervate are essentially your skeletal muscles. Those are the muscles attached to your bones. Okay. And finally, up here, the neurotransmitters, remember we have neurotransmitters here, as I mentioned before. In the case of in the case of the uh, somatic nervous system is acetylcholine, and here it's excitatory. So acetylcholine actually excites. It's excitatory. And remember, acetylcholine can be excitatory, can be inhibitory. In the case of these ones, it's excitatory, and the receptors here are nicotinic. And if you guys remember your, that's a receptor here. So these would be nicotinic, cholinergic, or food receptor. And if you go back and review the acetylcholine neurotransmitter slide, I did explain that already. That acetylcholine in the somatic nervous system acts as an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the skeletal muscles. That's basically how it works, and it excites these muscles. It's excitatory. It causes muscle contraction, right? When we look at now at the autonomic branch, it's a completely different ballgame. And first of all, we have two systems. We have sympathetic, parasympathetic. Secondly, we have two neurons. And if you look closely here, is that the preganglion neuron always releases acetylcholine, right? So this is from the preganglion. So from pregan. And then here, you may get acetylcholine or epinephrine, and you will get acetylcholine. First of all, they're both postganglion. Postgan. And you would get epinephrine or epinephrine if you had sympathetic nervous system. And you would have acetylcholine if you had parasympathetic nervous system. So in other words, you would get acetylcholine if you had if when you're looking at the preganglion, and it would be true, this would be true for both sympathetic, parasympathetic, but the postganglion would differ, would be different. If you had the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglion would release epinephrine or epinephrine. If your postganglion is of parasympathetic branch, it would release acetylcholine. Here's the effector organ, which we'll talk about in a second. So this information that I just told you here is actually nicely dissected out in this slide. So what you're seeing now on the top panel is what happens in the sympathetic nervous system, and what you see at the bottom panel is what happens at the parasympathetic nervous system. So in the sympathetic part, right, so that's the one on the top, that's the one at the bottom. What you notice is that in both cases, you release acetylcholine, as you can see here. That the preganglion releases acetylcholine, and the postganglion always has nicotinic receptors, right? So the postganglion receptors of cholinergic receptors here are nicotinic cholinergic, right here and right here. Now, in the case of sympathetic, the postganglion releases norepinephrine, epinephrine. So you would have to have adrenergic receptors over here, The postganglion in the case of parasympathetic nervous system still releases acetylcholine, which is the same acetylcholine here, except the receptors in the effector organ here are not nicotinic, they are muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Okay, so hopefully you guys can rewind if you have to and review. So one more time. In both cases, sympathetic, parasympathetic, the preganglion releases acetylcholine. In both cases of sympathetic, parasympathetic, the receptors of the postganglion on the postganglion are both nicotinic, cholinergic. What's different is two things. At the postganglion level, number one, the postganglion in the sympathetic branch releases norepinephrine, epinephrine, and the effector organ here would be adrenergic receptors. I would have adrenergic receptors because of the norepinephrine, epinephrine neurotransmitters. Down here, the postganglion releases acetylcholine, but the receptors on the effector organ, that would be this muscle here, for example, are not nicotinic. They're actually muscarinic cholinergic receptors. If you have a muscle, in the case of uh, parasympathetic nervous system, here the acetylcholine happens to be inhibitory. So here the acetylcholine happens to be inhibitory. This would be inhibitory acetylcholine. Again, we're talking about that's mostly talking about muscle. Although it doesn't have to be muscle, it can be something else. But if it's a muscle, by the way, what muscle are we talking about here? It's not a skeletal muscle. Could be a muscle of the heart, or it could be um, um, muscles of the smooth muscles of the blood vessels, so on and so forth. So it causes muscle relaxation, actually. That's basically the take-home message, that these smooth muscles undergo relaxation because of the muscarinic nature of these receptors. Okay, so next we have what we call the adrenal medulla, which is basically, as you can see here, is modified sympathetic postganglionic nerves. So if you remember this picture here that I drew, and I'm going to draw it again. I'm going to actually draw that myself. So consider, before I talk about the adrenal gland, I do want to mention one thing. That first of all, where is adrenal gland and what is it? Well, first of all, adrenal gland is located on your kidneys, and they're located right here on the top of the kidney. They basically have this thing called the cortex. I'm going to label in blue. So I'm going to label in blue. And of course, this core, which we call medulla or adrenal. And then this part, which we call okay. So that's our adrenal gland. That's our adrenal gland right here. The adrenal medulla is basically modified nervous tissue. Now let me explain what that means. What we said previously was that if you have your spinal cord, so let's go back to your spinal cord here again. That when we look at the nerve, right? Again, if you just look at this arm here, we're interested in the motor arm, right? Coming out that way. That's the motor arm. But let's say here we're looking at sympathetic motor system. That it was basically comprised of. It was basically comprised of. It was basically comprised of two nerves, right? And you would have the effector organ. Do you follow so far? And if you guys remember, this was our preganglion. I'm going to say pregan. This would be our post. And this would be our effector organ. And if you remember what we said was that here you're going to get some. Let me just draw this nicely for you so you can see exactly what's going on. And what we said here was that here you're going to get acetylcholine, and here you would have receptors, which would be nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Here you would have still acetylcholine, but the receptors here would be muscarinic cholinergic receptors, okay, called R. So what's important again to understand for insofar as the what we call this adrenal medulla goes is as follows. Are you ready? Guys, this part right here, just put this. So if I were to show you a division, so imagine now I take a look at this, watch. If you take this part, you guys with me? If you take this purple section and you modify it, so this is the post ganglion nerve or neuron, and you modify that, change it, you get what we call adrenal medulla. By the way, I made a mistake, guys. This is sympathetic. This is supposed to be not acetylcholine, actually. That's supposed to be norepinephrine, epinephrine. This blue receptor would be adrenergic receptors. Sorry, my apologies. So here you actually release norepinephrine, epinephrine, and you bind to these adrenergic receptors in the effector organ. Okay, so take your postganglion and you modify that, right? So that's the idea. You modify it and you get adrenal medulla. Now, first of all, notice that this has nothing to do with the cortex. Okay, so we are not talking about the cortex in any way, shape, or form. We are talking about, however, about the postganglion adrenal medulla. So adrenal medulla essentially is modified postganglion. So you could say that this is basically modified postganglion postganglion of sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so I hope it makes sense. Now, if you modify that, you basically get adrenal medulla. So now, if you hopefully you can see that a bit better here in this picture. So first of all, this is your uh, adrenal gland. You can see that's the medulla in the middle. And on the top, you've got adrenal cortex. This is an endocrine tissue, but this is modified sympathetic ganglion, post-sympathetic postganglion. And these are just parts of the cross section of the adrenal gland. Here's the medulla that we're interested in at the bottom. All of these parts are actually part of the adrenal cortex. So all of that, zona fasciculata, reticularis, they're all part of the cortex, which we don't care about. You only are talking about the medulla for this lesson. So by the same token, then this is your first neuron. That's the preganglion neuron. You can see it's basically releasing these acetylcholines right here. You have the receptors in the medulla, which would be just like above. They would be nicotinic receptors, right? And doesn't show you that here, but the receptors here would be nicotinic. And then the cells in the medulla, because they're postganglion, they would have to release epinephrine or epinephrine. And in this case, they're showing you epinephrine, which is fine. They're showing you epinephrine release. And the cells, by the way, when you modify the postganglion, you don't call them postganglion, you call them chromaffin cells. So more specifically, these are basically modified. These are basically modified sympathetic. Oh, it says right here. I don't need to write that down. It's written right here. These are modified postganglion sympathetic neurons. Okay. So that being said, you've got your adrenal medulla, it releases epinephrine, which then, as you can see, it's affecting these blood vessels. So that's essentially the story behind adrenal medulla. So hopefully that's clear now. Again, notice that the cortex is essentially an endocrine tissue. That's not what we will talk about that later on in the endocrine class. Let's now move on to our parasympathetic nervous system and the details of the system and what it does. First things first, you can see, as I mentioned before, this system's neurons or nerves come off the cranial output and the sacral output. And the cranial output includes a bunch of nerves, including the vagus nerve, as you can see. That's this last one here, by the way, guys. That's the vagus nerve. I think it says right here. Yeah. So this nerve, which I'm going to, because it's important, I'm going to actually label it in blue right here. And you can see this nerve goes to many organs, including your lungs, your heart, the liver, the GI tract, and different parts of the body. Call that 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve. Okie dokie. So this whole thing is vagus nerve. It's just branches into different branches. There are other nerves coming from the cranium, as you can see. The other ones mostly go to your eyes and your head, right? So collectively, those are ganglia which are very close to your head. And the vagus nerve must be very long, right? Because it has to reach many parts of your body. When you look at lower parts of your GI tract, you can see there are nerves that are coming out of your sacral output, which go to your genitals, vagina, penis, and the ureter here. And in terms of what this nervous system does, is it essentially allows you to do 3 R's: rest, relax, ruminate. And there's another acronym we can use, which is SLUT: salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. All right. So essentially, the function of the parasympathetic system is to calm you down. It decreases heart rate. It decreases respiratory rate. It allows for more digestive function. It actually boosts up your function the digestive tract function, right? Um, which makes sense. You can only eat and enjoy food when you're relaxed, when your heart rate is sort of at rest, when you're breathing normally. If you're hyperventilating, you go something like that, you're probably not going to be able to eat, right? So this system knows that it calms you down through your heart and your lungs so you can actually breathe and relax so that you can eat. That's sort of the argument. Rest, relax, ruminate. Remember that. And the sympathetic nervous system is basically the opposite, right? So now you've got first things first, you can see it's coming, the nerves are coming from the thoracic output as well as the lumbar output, as I mentioned before, thoracic and lumbar, and they go to many parts of your body. Now, there are some differences here with regards to the presynapse and the postsynaptic ganglions, okay? So it turns out, guys, listen to this. Remember, both of these two systems, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, they both have or are of two nerve systems. So in other words, or sorry, two neuron system. You have two neurons, one, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. And you might be saying, Arash, but in the case of vagus nerve, I only see one neuron. Where is the second neuron? Well, let me just start with these neurons on the top. First of all, on the top, you can see the two neuron system is very clear. By the way, the dotted line here is supposed to denote the what we call postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron. So preganglionic neurons, postganglionic neurons. For the case of, in the case of the face, because the face is right next to the head, remember, these are cranial nerves going to your face. It's a very short distance. Um, the relative length of the pre and post ganglions is sort of irrelevant. But when you look at these organs which are very distal, they're very far off of your head, like your heart, your lungs, your gut, that it turns out in the parasympathetic nervous system that the preganglion is very long and the postganglion is actually very, very short. And if you're wondering where is the synapse, this circle, guys, is supposed to, these circles, these black circles, do you see them? And this circle is supposed to show you the connection, the synapse between the preganglion and the postganglion. So I'm going to zoom in, but there's no way you can see the postganglion here, right? The second nerve you simply cannot see, or the neuron you cannot see because it's very, very short. So the idea is that in the case of parasympathetic nervous system, that the preganglion is very long. You can see the same thing here. And the postganglions, which would be inside the circles, which we don't see because it's super, super short, would be at the site of the effector organ. That's the feature of the parasympathetic two neuron system. When we now switch to the sympathetic neuron system, is the complete opposite situation. The presynapse or the preganglions are very short, and the postganglions are super, super, super long. Okay, so preganglion short, postganglion long, preganglion long, postganglion short in those circles, which you don't see. The other difference between the system, as I mentioned, is where the nerves come from, which we already discussed. The third difference is, remember I told you that there are these ganglions outside of the sympathetic ganglions, right outside of the spine. Do you guys remember this picture here? Actually, I think it was right. It was right at the beginning of our right here. I talked about these sympathetic ganglia. So now let's talk about them, right? So what are these and what do they have to do with the sympathetic nervous system? So let's discuss that. So when it comes to your sympathetic nervous system, these what we call sympathetic ganglia, okay? Now, you may think that there's not, but there are connections. They just didn't show you that, okay? In fact, they're also shown here on both sides. Remember, they go both left and right. Right? This would be, I guess, you're looking at the brain from the front, so that would be your left side. That's your right side. Right? So you have these ganglia on the left and on the right. Their function is as follows. The sympathetic ganglia are the site where the preganglion meets the postganglions, first of all, for most of your uh, ganglia of your sympathetic innervations, except for a few which are off of these ganglia. And they're very close to the spine itself, right? So it says here the sympathetic, and we call them sympathetic trunk because what happens is they actually interconnect. They actually interconnect. So this ganglia here connects with the one on the top and with the one at the bottom, and then this one connects with the one at the bottom, so on and so forth. So these ganglia are interconnected vertically within each other, okay, amongst each other. And they is far from the effectors, as we can see, these are the effector organs. And the other thing is that the neurons run up and down the chain, broadcasting the sympathetic message. All right, and the sympathetic ganglia marked in the circle are called collateral ganglia. Okay, so the sympathetic ganglia marked by circles. Those are these ones here, called collateral, and are far from the effectors too. You don't need to worry too much about these collateral ones. Okay. And some sympathetic neurons have a split axons that send messages up and down the sympathetic trunk and also out to collateral ganglia. So what does this mean? Well, this means that when your sympathetic nervous system is turned on, and you must remember, you want to remember that the function of this system is to fight, allow you to fight, flight, or fright. Essentially summarizes the function. And you want to remember that when you're trying to boost your heart up, right? You want to turn this heart rate up and increase force of contraction because you're under fight and flight situation. Let's say you just saw a big bear in the forest and you want to run away, right? You want to essentially flight or fight. That you want to have higher heart rate, but you also want to have higher respiratory rate at the same time. You also want to make sure that your gut is shut down at the same time. You also want to make sure that your genitals are not necessarily active at the same time. You also want to make sure that your eyes, pupils are dilated so you can have maximal vision at the same time. So this need for having a synchronous response, right? The need for having a synchrony is mediated or is achieved by having this trunk or interconnections of all these ganglia or these sympathetic ganglia, and they crosstalk. When one nerve comes and activates the ganglia here, it sends signal up and down so that the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and everybody else at the same time gets activated. If you've ever, and that's a function of this sympathetic trunk structure, is to ensure synchrony between all organs at the same time. We didn't have to do that up here. For the parasympathetic nervous system, you're supposed to be relaxed and ruminating and resting anyways. There's no need to be organized or, do you know what I mean? Like there's no urgency, there's no dire situation. But here the situation is probably very dire, very serious, very urgent. And so that urgency needs coordination, synchrony between all these organs, which is mediated by this trunk. Um, so, right, so just make sure you guys understand that when it comes to your sympathetic nervous system. This slide is also showing you the same thing, except essentially it's a summary of what happens in which organ. You can see, for example, it says the heart rate will decrease, or I don't know, in the case of the sympathetic nervous system, it increases contractility as well as heart rate, so on and so forth. So you can read that for yourself. Referred pain essentially refers to this point that, so this would be essentially mostly uh, related to the somatic branch, somatosensory branch. Essentially, the idea is this. If you get, okay, so take a look at this region in pink. So this person's chest and its inner left arm and the inner finger. They're all the same color, correct? Turns out that the nerves that send signal from the chest to the spine and the nerves that come and get the pain from your arm and the nerve which takes the pain from your lower arm and the nerve which takes the pain from the lower finger, they all merge into the same nerve, which goes to your spine and goes to your brain. And because of that, because of the fact that the sensory nerve that takes information here, takes the information from your chest and your lower arm, inner arm, and your lower arm, and your lower inner finger are all the same nerve at the end. They all merge into same nerve. That if you get a pain from point A, you may actually feel pain from your inner finger because your brain is not going to be able to tell apart the pain coming from point A versus point B. Why? Because your brain got the message from the same nerve. Does that make sense? So because of that, uh, this becomes important in diagnosis because let's say you had angina, let's say you had heart attack, for example. You're supposed to get the pain from your chest, but turns out that you usually, if not always, get the pain radiating down your left arm and sometimes in your small index finger, sorry, the inner finger, and sometimes, as you can see here, in your jaw as well. So remember, this says heart, which means the heart pain can come from the back of your jaw and your chest and your inner left arm. Let's go referred pain. Same thing for the kidneys and the liver and gallbladder. For your sensation and perception, I'm not going to test much. In fact, I'm going to say these are not on test. Technically, we talked about the somatosensory sensation before. This slide was briefly discussed before. This is also not on test. This slide shows you what happens with regards to our chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. And if you remember my slide on carotids, the internal, external carotid, and the vertebral carotid, I told you that you find chemoreceptors, baroreceptors there. And finally, this slide which shows you electromagnetic type receptors. Basically, that this slide here and this slide here shows you different types of receptors. And these receptors are not the receptors we discussed on the cell with regards like metaboreceptor or ion channel receptor. That's a different type of receptor. A receptor in the nervous system is a type of specialized cell. Is a type of a specialized cell which carries specific function to translate specific type of a stimulus into electrical stimulus. An electromagnetic receptor is a nervous cell tissue cell that turns electromagnetic radiation, that's essentially light, into electrical signal. Those for your eyes are your cones and rods, by the way. Okay, those are your electromagnetic receptors. A baroreceptor is a specialized cell that turns pressure into electric signal reaction potential. A chemoreceptor is a cell or a nervous tissue cell that turns changes in chemistry, in this case pH, carbon dioxide concentration, so on and so forth, into electrical activity reaction potential. And there's other types of receptors. This one is also not on test. Essentially, it shows you how adaptation happens. I'll give you one quick example of what this means. You may have experienced this yourself. Sometimes you walk into a room or a person walks into a room and they're basically having their food with them, and their food in the dish, has a very strong smell, right? And it's the same food, and after a few minutes, you no longer can smell the food, or you no longer notice the food scent. That doesn't mean that the food smell went away. This food smell still was or is there, except you just don't feel it anymore. You don't sense it anymore. That phenomenon is known as adaptation. The mechanism of it is explained here, but you don't need to know. Okay, so that's it for now, guys. In a separate set of videos, I'll explain the visual system and the ears.